Good morning. Since last time, I received many of your papers, and I duly read them. And I didn't make, usually I would make red marks on them and pass them back with all my comments and corrections. However, this time I just read them over for reasons that may be understandable. Incidentally, what I would suggest when you do a paper, get someone to read it, because sometimes you will make mistakes that someone, a younger brother or an older sister, or a parent or a grandparent might be able to pick and then ask you to clarify. So whenever you do a paper, get someone to read the paper, because there were, needless to say, I mean, there were some that were very good, and there were some which were less than very good, but they were, in no case did it hurt your grade, unless you turned it in late. And as I say, there are a few that are outstanding. They haven't been turned in yet. Incidentally, I've always taken the view that when I stop learning from my students, I'm going to quit teaching. And I learned quite a bit from many of the papers, so your efforts were appreciated. And I'll try to get the grades back to you somehow on Monday. Okay. Anyway, today what we want to get into is social classes, right? And it's classes are, well, classes have been a part of society ever since the time of Plato, and obviously even before Plato, because Plato is describing that there were classes even in his ideal republic. And the basis for classes in Plato I dealt with in another class, but anyway, on the bottom of page 178, Marx asked the question. The first question to be answered is, what constitutes a class? Okay? And the answer can be found by answering another question. What constitutes wage laborers? Now, in other words, wage laborers are those who, capitalism begins when labor becomes a commodity. And there are wage laborers who sell their labor to the capitalist. Then there are also the capitalists. And what else? And the landlords. Okay. Marx quite often is thinking more in terms of England than the Germany from which he came, because England became a capitalist industrial country much sooner than did Germany. Anyway, so what constitutes wage laborers, capitalists, and landlords as the three great social classes? Now, according to Marx, you develop the consciousness from the class to which you belong, right? So in other words, the wage laborer is going to have a special consciousness, as is the capitalist, as is the landlord. Okay, now in England, the landlords became largely the House of Lords. I suppose we shouldn't necessarily give it a capital, but and then of course there were the House of Commons, and there were also the Tories, right, in England. Now, as he goes on to say, at first glance it might seem that the identity of revenues and of sources of revenue is responsible. The classes are three great social groups whose components, the individual members, live from wages. The profit, capitalists, right, and rent, right, okay? So, in other words, those who have property get rents from the, for what is produced on their estates, and they get rents from those who do the labor in those, on those estates. Now, if you're going to have, okay, we know what a revolution is, and also the basic ingredients, right? The ingredients for a revolution. Well, of course, what do you have to have? Well, you have to have the enemy, right? And of course, for Marx, the enemy is the capitalists. For a popular revolution and the emancipation of a particular class, okay, and you need remember the lumpen proletariat? Okay, the lumpen proletariat are the people who live in rags and tatters, lumpen. So for a popular revolution and the emancipation of a particular class, namely the lumpen proletariat, of civil society coincide. For one class to represent the whole of society, another class must concentrate in itself all the evils of the society, right, the enemy, and a particular class must embody and represent a general obstacle and limitation. Okay, so, and then what is it? Needless to say, you also need the intellectuals, and the reason you need the intellectuals is because the proletariat, or the people who are, which is a class that is no class. A class that is no class. It doesn't mean that they don't necessarily have class, they're a class that is no class. Right? It's the class that represents all those who sank to the bottom of the society, for one reason or another. Either because they represented guilds which were destroyed or ruined by the Industrial Revolution, and then of course, needless to say, you also need you need bomb makers. Okay, in other words, someone who can make the bombs. Dynamite, remember? Okay, and the middle of page 180. Moreover, there is also lacking in every class the generosity which identifies itself, if only for a moment, with the popular mind. That genius which pushes material force to political power, that revolutionary daring which throws at its adversary the defiant phrase, "I am nothing, I shall be everything." Okay? In other words, the revolutionary. Okay? I am nothing, I should be everything. Well, they have absolutely nothing to lose. They've got nothing. Okay, let's move on. Over on page 182, the second paragraph. Where is there then a real possibility of emancipation in Germany? This is our reply. A class must be formed which has radical change, okay? The lumpenproletariat, the wage laborers. A class in civil society which is not a class of civil society, a class that is no class. The class to which everyone in the society, rural people whose farms are not working, who move to the city, which a sphere of society which has a universal character because its sufferings are universal, and which does not claim a particular redress because of wrong which is done to it. It is not a particular wrong, but wrong in general. Okay, in other words, you're going to need a revolutionary base, right? In more modern types of revolutions, you saw this in France. Every once in a while in France, you had to get a revolutionary base in order to have any kind of revolution, any kind of basic radical change in French politics. And that meant you had to get two groups together. You had to get not only the workers, but the students. If you had the workers, but not the students, it wouldn't work. If you had the students, but not the workers, it didn't work. Right? Once in a while, the students would revolt because they didn't like the system, the exam system in France, which was deadly. And so the students would revolt. But if workers didn't go along with it, it didn't happen. On the other hand, if the workers could seek a revolution, but if the students didn't go along with it, it didn't happen, right? So you had to, in more modern terms, you need a revolutionary base, and at least in France, you needed both workers and students if you're going to have anything that was going to work. Over on page 184, the proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. Incidentally, that word bourgeoisie is bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie. Okay, that's French. It's a French word. Okay, and it translates the German Bürgerliche Gesellschaft. Okay, that's Hegel. Okay, and that's a burger is a citizen, right? So it's a society of citizens, and this is a good term in Hegel. Okay, bourgeoisie is bourgeois. It translates but this is the Marxian translation, and it's not good. The bourgeoisie is bad. Okay. If you remember, the French Revolution was a revolution of the bourgeoisie, okay, against the king. So the proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the workpeople of a factory, then by the operatives of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. Okay, in England, you had what were called the Fabian socialists. And they indulged in what was called sabotage. A sabot is a French shoe, but more specifically, it's kind of like a sabot. It's a wooden shoe. These are not well-made shoes. They're certainly not custom made. Anyway, the Fabian socialists would throw their sabots, their shoes, into the machinery that produced the product. Right? In other words, this was their way of. It was more than protest. Okay, this was their way of revolting against situation. They directed their attack not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. Right? They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash the pieces of machinery, set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workman of the Middle Ages. Marx would describe them as revanchists. In other words, they're Marx's view toward the Middle Ages is somewhat ambivalent. To some extent, he appreciates the Middle Ages as being a stable society. On the other hand, he sees it as the basis of feudalism, which he really doesn't approve of. Moving right along. Over on page 185. It was just this, middle of the page, it was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles. In other words, one thing which made possible for example, the revolution in 1848 was the greater communication that existed as a result of the development of the telegraph, etc. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles. Well, when Marx is, remember, it's the international. Okay, it was international communism. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Okay, remember, Hegel, of course, his belief is in the nation state. Whereas Marx is an internationalist. Okay. One nation between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle. Okay? Remember, politics, for Marx, politics follows economics. Something which I'm not convinced the Chinese, who are supposedly Marxist, really appreciate it. Because if you give economic freedom, as China certainly has done, political freedom is going to follow, according to Marx. But of course, it doesn't quite work that way in China, because I don't think they're true Marxists. But we won't go, okay. And that union to which the burghers of the Middle Ages, burghers, as in burger Gesellschaft, the burghers of the Middle Ages with their miserable highways required centuries the modern proletarians, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years. Okay, communication and transportation. That made for a much more international sort of economic world. Okay, let's move over to page 188, the middle paragraph there. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants, right, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, okay? They sink into this class that really is no class. Partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on. Well, think of the corner grocery store, right? What does the corner grocery store do when Walmart moves into the vicinity? It's not easy. Because the corner grocery store, the mom and pop store on the corner, is not going to be able to compete with Walmart, and is swamped in the competition with large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new means of production. Well, a large chain like Walmart's is much more powerful than anything that can be managed on a local basis. Okay. Well, all you have to do is think in terms of what's going to happen to retail, or what is happening to retail with the advent of Amazon, right? When you can, and it's going to be exacerbated by the fact that all the retail stores are closed, but you can still buy on Amazon at the present time. So Amazon is going to become even more powerful, and what's going to happen to retail stores when they are allowed to reopen, that is a real question mark. And thus the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population, all classes of the population. And of course, the modern phenomenon in industrial production is what is called outsourcing. Capitalism seeks the cheapest labor it can find. Where is the cheapest labor? It is not necessarily in the major industrial, the G7. It's not necessarily in the G7. It's in places like Bangladesh. All you have to do is check the label on one of your recent objects of clothing where it was produced, right? Bangladesh, Vietnam, Haiti, I don't know where else. But wherever the labor is cheapest, that's where the capitalists are going to go. Okay, moving right along. Over on page 189. The immediate result of machinery, right, is to augment surplus value, right? And the surplus value, of course, goes to the capitalist, right? Which means that the capitalist always, he gets not only the exchange value, but the surplus value. And the exchange value is what you can buy with whatever is produced. Surplus value is what we today would call profit, and that's going to go to the capitalist. And as the substances consumed by the capitalists and their dependents become more plentiful, right? In other words, you have an expanding economy, so these social strata increase in numbers, right? And okay, what you develop, right? What you develop is what we today call a consumer economy, right? And if the economy doesn't, if the consumers do not consume, they're not doing their duty regarding the economy, so that the thing keeps expanding, right? At the moment, of course, it's shrinking, but we don't want to go there. Okay, okay, their growing wealth and the relatively diminished number of workmen required because of machinery, the use of robots, artificial intelligence makes it even worse. Required to produce the necessities of life lead both to the rise of new and luxurious wants and to new means of satisfying those wants. In other words, you develop a consumer economy, and it's necessary for you to consume. Okay, moving over on to page 190, the middle paragraph there. This circumstance that a man without wealth, but with energy, strength of character, ability, and business sense, is able to become a capitalist is greatly admired by the economic apologists of capitalism. Well, they are before your time, but there was a whole series of novels about a young man who had strength of character, energy, ability, etc. And it's how he made it, pulled him up by his own bootstraps and became rich and wealthy, right? One of the fathers of our country, right, extolled all the virtues that the Horatio Alger novels embodied. Is greatly admired by economic apologists of capitalism, since it shows that the commercial value of each individual is more or less accurately estimated under the capitalist mode of production. You too can become part of the American dream. Okay. Although this situation continually brings an unwelcome number of new soldiers of fortune into the field, dog-eat-dog capitalism, it also consolidates the rule of capital itself, enlarges its basis, and enables it to recruit ever new forces for itself out of lower layers of society. In a similar way, the circumstance that the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages formed its hierarchy with the best brains from among the people, without regard to estate, birth, or wealth, was one of the principal means of consolidating priestly rule and the subordination of the laity. Right? Okay? And I mean, Marx is, it's true. I mean, where were the first schools in the Middle Ages? They were the monasteries, and later the dioceses, the clergy, right? And if you became a cleric, you got educated. And there were those who, and which meant you had to get a tonsure. I take off my hat to show you my tonsure, but it's unnecessary. They became clerics, and therefore they could be educated in the cathedral schools or in the monastery schools. And this was a way in which some of the brightest young minds got co-opted into the medieval system. Well, Marx says the same thing is true today, right? In other words, there are those, the more a ruling class is able to assimilate the most prominent men of the dominated classes, the more stable and dangerous is its rule. He shouldn't have had the word dangerous. The more secure is its rule, right? In other words, by co-opting, many of the major universities give special scholarships to bright, but poor students who are unable to afford, what is the tuition at Stanford these days? What? The last figure I heard is about $50,000 a year, right? Or more. Anyway, needless to say, people can't afford to do that. However, there are worthy students, good students, who are able to get the scholarships and thus and are thereby co-opted into the system. A perfect example was Obama, right? Obama didn't start out rich, right? However, Obama did get a scholarship. I forget. I think it was Harvard, wasn't it? And therefore got a very good education. He went on to teach constitutional law at the University of Chicago, which is no slouch of an institution. And so, I mean, when Obama would make criticisms of some of the Supreme Court rulings, he knew whereof he spoke. Anyway, Obama was co-opted into the capitalist system, right? I mean, after all, when the big crash, not the big crash, but when the recession occurred in 2008, 2009, what was one of the first things he did? Well, of course, he reestablished the auto industry, that was for the workers. Okay, that's good Democrat. But on the other hand, he also pumped money, funds to save the banks, the financial system, right? Now, that had already been begun under Bush, but Obama continued it with a vengeance, right? And as a result, saved the financial system, right? Indicating the extent to which he'd been co-opted into the system, right? Remember, education, according to Hegel, renders people unequal, right? Marx would agree. And it's something that the capitalist has learned, right? It's good to have people co-opted into the system so that, especially if they've got brains, and thereby aid the system. Okay. Let's go a little further. Yeah, here we go. This section, of course, is on social classes and class conflict. Right? Okay, we saw that already in England, right? In England you had the Commons, the Tories, the Lords, and they were different classes in England, and they all had different aims, goals, and purposes, and they were in conflict with each other, right? The House of Lords, the House of Commons, and of course the Tories usually represented the capitalists, what the French sneeringly referred to as the nouveau riche. The French have good ways of sneering at people and classes. The history of all, okay, bottom of page 200, and then we're going to quit because I'm getting tired. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles, right? There have always been class struggles. There have always been classes, and there have always been class struggles. I mean, when Marx wants to see a classless society, point one, it didn't happen in any communist country, but it was the ideal. A classless society in which there would be no longer any class struggles. Well, maybe the revolution happened, right? The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. Freeman and slave. Patrician and plebeian. Pleb means people, right? Plebs means people in Latin. Lord and serf, right? Guildmaster and journeyman, right? The journeyman is starting out, the apprentice is the lower. There's an even lower class. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. I mean, there can be battles between the commons and depending on who wins, the others lose. I mean, let's face it. Which is the important house in Parliament, in the English Parliament? Right? What are the Lords? Bunch of clergymen, former estate owners. Tories, yeah, well, the capitalists are still there, but it's Commons that really holds the political power in England. Okay. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. Right? in every society there's social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. Slaves, of course, were at the bottom. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guild masters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all these classes, again, there are subordinate gradations. It was very interesting. When I was studying in France, I had dinner with a professor at the, I think it was at the Sorbonne. And he told me when you began as a lowly professor, right, as an instructor, basically, you generally joined the Communist Party. When you moved up a rank academically, you might become a socialist. But when you became a full professor, you turned conservative with a vengeance, right? There were, even in the professorial ranks, there were classes. Okay, the modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society, okay, the feudal society, of course, went its way, has not done away with class antagonisms. Of course it hasn't. But it has established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Right? In other words, we no longer have slaves, serfs, but we do have illegals. What are the illegals? The illegals are people who are in the country illegally, but who work, who are able to work. I think get a green card and are able to work, and however, they are not in a, shall we say, a secure political position, right? In other words, they can be, especially if they commit any crime, they can be deported immediately. That was, of course, one of the problems with the mafia, right? If you committed a crime, you could be deported. Well, there were many mafia don which, when they got, they'd serve a prison sentence and they'd be deported back to la bella Sicilia. Che peccato. Our epic, the epic of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Oh yeah, it has simplified things a bit. Well, we're all consumers. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps. Well, that was in Marx's time. Into two great classes facing each other directly, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Okay? In other words, as far as, remember, bourgeoisie for Marx is a pejorative term. Pejorative. You look down your nose at it. Peor means worse. So you take a pejorative view of people down there, and that's what the word bourgeoisie does. And whereas proletariat for him is a good thing, because that's going to be the basis, the revolutionary base for the revolution. Okay, I'm tired. Let's quit. We'll see you on Monday.